Member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker. It's with great happiness, in fact, that I rise to speak to this debate, because what we're doing today is something of historical significance that will, I think, both be remembered and put in context our own history as a province. This piece of legislation, Bill 3, which is part of a suite of measures that has been developed over the last few years, recognizes historic injustice in our province, in this case in particular, as expressed to the Chinese Canadian community, but as the Minister will know and as members of the House will know, almost all the legislation and all the acts that we're talking about were also used in a discriminatory way against the Japanese Canadian community, against the South Asian community. My colleague, the member from Vancouver Mount Pleasant, just spoke eloquently about the impact on First Nations and on First Nations communities of similar laws over the really a very significant part of the first century of British Columbia's existence. It's important to remember, and it's always important to think of history in context, and I think that's important in this case. But you know, Honourable Speaker, some of the people that we judge most highly in history, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, often recognized as a great Canadian Prime Minister. We think of his quote, though, which reflects, in a sense, one strand of the racism of Canadian and British Columbia policy in the period leading up from Confederation through its first 70 years. Sir Wilfrid Laurier said, "The people of Canada," and this was expressed in policy, "want to have a white country." And then, Honourable Speaker, Sir Richard McBride, who in some ways was a Premier of British Columbia, we know from New Westminster to Vancouver to other communities, Richard McBride's name is in the front of schools today and so on, but nonetheless, as Premier of British Columbia, expressed through dozens of laws and dozens of administrative actions of government, if not hundreds, said very clearly, British Columbia shall be a white man's province. And indeed, these two steps, they weren't, Honourable Speaker, examples of political excess. These were not, if you will, the statements of the David Dukes of the day, people perceived to be on the political margins. They were truly at the center of Canadian and British Columbia politics and policy. They were not excess at all. In fact, this province gave life to a version of what we call Jim Crow laws that was so extensive, in the hundreds of laws, passed over the dozens and dozens of years, indeed decades, Honourable Speaker, not really reversed for 100 years after British Columbia joined Confederation. They reflect, Honourable Speaker, what we were as a province. Many great things, of course, but also a place of profound divisions, of the centerpiece. You will not find another Canadian province where you have this many discriminatory provisions. The Minister found 204. I'm going to talk about that process in a second. Over time that had been identified in this process, 19 of which were dealing with this bills as being still, in a sense, active. 204. You'll see almost none of those provisions in any other province of Canada. If anything, Honourable Speaker, one thinks of the sort of vision of Alabama at a certain point in the 1960s with the governor on the schoolhouse steps blocking people from attending university. In that state, these matters are fixed in our memories. Anyone who follows American culture, and that is most of us in Canada, who watch American movies, and that is most of us in Canada, who understand the impact of that American debate still on American society, have to recognize that here in British Columbia, while it has not been in as many movies, and it is not seen in as many historical texts, had our own story, our own vision. And if you will, Honourable Speaker, and I think of Laurier and McBride as two significant, even great Canadian and British Columbia historical figures, Honourable Speaker, in their views, they reflected the two strands of this. The strand that was, on the one hand, and was mostly represented at the federal level, importing labor, Honorable Speaker, without rights, treated horribly, dying in the thousands in the workplace building the National Railway. That's the one strand. We must have access to cheap labor. That was the federal stand and led the federal government to disallow many British Columbia bills. And then we have the other strand, which is British Columbia, which passed law after law after law after law that said Chinese Canadians, in this case, don't have the right to vote. Chinese Canadians don't have any rights under the law. Chinese Canadians don't have the right to work in workplaces. In detail, and the detail of these bills, the pettiness of the provisions in these bills speaks to that. So we had two competing ideas, both racist, in fact, both treating people as not just second-class citizens, but third and fourth and fifth-class citizens, operating at the same time to some extent in conflict with one another, but profoundly real. And I think that is at the core of why this is important, because it is important, it seems to me, to understand how far we've come, but it is critical to see where we've been and why our province developed in the way it does, to understand that, to own our history, not just, Honourable Speaker, to ignore it, which seems to be, in some ways, in vogue today. Now, Honourable Speaker, this particular piece of legislation, of course, and this particular process came out of what one might describe as some incredibly partisan maneuvers by the current government around these questions. Partisan maneuvers which were found, and I think generally accepted, to have been profoundly in error. And so we came through a process, and some people refer to and may have discussed in the bill what this is about, which was, in that case, quick wins. And we have to understand why we as a province and people as a province condemn that so roundly. Because a lot of what we see here in this legislation, and a lot of the legislation that was passed, even though the legislators who sat in this very chamber knew those laws would be disallowed by the federal government, was a form of legislative riot, effectively trying to use the symbols of hatred and racism for political gain, something that was repeatedly used in election campaigns, repeatedly used right up to the 1930s and beyond by political parties in this province, principally liberal and conservative political parties of the time at both the federal and provincial level, but no one is exempted. No one has entirely clean hands in this effort. So one of the reasons after the last election, the official opposition took a great interest in this issue, this question of laws. One of the reasons we went out and researched the question and did our own analysis of what had happened in British Columbia was to return this debate not to a debate about political expediency, not to view this debate about our history, about racism, about fundamental human rights as transactional politics, but to treat it seriously as an opportunity for education, an opportunity to understand where we'd come from. And so we worked with the Legislative Library, and we found, Honourable Speaker, about 150 laws. There are more provisions found since then, but we found about 150 laws, 7 reports, 2 resolutions from the Committee of Supply Authorizing Expenditures, which were, on the face of them, racist, Honourable Speaker. The intent of these laws, as I said, was to fill the vision of a white man's province. And what did these laws reflect? Well, many of them reflected what's reflected in the laws dealt with in this legislation, Honourable Speaker. 89 of the legislative part of that, Honourable Speaker, a majority reflected labor and employment rights, just like these bills did here. In other words, if you were to get access to government contracts, you could not employ anyone who is Chinese Canadian or Japanese Canadian or South Asian, Honourable Speaker. A whole bunch of them, 12, reflected what are called economic and social rights, people's right to participate fully in the economy. 10 voting rights, 9 immigration issues. Those bills were largely disallowed by the federal government. And 1 even about vital statistics. Of the motion, most dealt with immigration, but also labor and employment rights, the Chinese head tax, economic rights and taxes, health, and voting rights, Honourable Speaker. they were consistently, as these are, derogatory in tone. In other words, the legislators who sat here didn't just see it as appropriate to pass legislation that was discriminatory, but to state within those legislations, as the purpose of those legislations, plainly vicious thoughts. Those were the ones supporting them. Those were the ones saying that those were the ones suggesting that people's very existence undermined what was fundamental to our province, Honorable Speaker. And, Honorable Speaker, the result of that was, and this was the first strand, this was the British Columbia strand, this is what we're dealing with in this bill today, was the very exchange I talked about at the beginning between provincial and federal governments. A sort of legislative riot at the provincial level, disallowed 24 times by the federal government in between 1878 and 1921, Honorable Speaker. So what did the Prime Minister say? He reflected the other hand, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, in doing it. Quote, "It is better to have Chinese labor than no labor at all. At any moment when the legislature of Canada chooses, it can shut down the gate and say no more immigrants shall come here from China. And those in the country at the time will rapidly disappear, and therefore there is no fear of permanent degradation by a mongrel race," Honorable Speaker. And so if you look at that in context, Honorable Speaker, understand in context what this debate was and where we were as a province. This was at the very root of our province, after all. The railway was built by this labor that created British Columbia. This is at the very root of where we are. It's why it's important not to place this kind of history and these kind of attacks on human rights, or suggest that they can't come back as they are in some parts of the world today. It's important to place them in historical context, and it's surely, these are the last things, the absolute last things that politicians should be using for political gain in the present, because they were used for that purpose in the past. Consider this legislature and what it did in 1927. Consider what the state of affairs was in 1927. The Chinese head tax, the Exclusion Acts, Honorable Speaker, second-class status, no right to vote, dozens of laws barring Chinese Canadians and Japanese Canadians and South Asian from jobs, the public service, working on public works, and this legislature, this place, wasn't satisfied, Honorable Speaker. They commissioned a report, Honorable Speaker, the purpose of which was to decide whether legislation can be enacted to prevent the Chinese and Japanese Canadians from owning, selling, leasing, or renting land in British Columbia. To cut off even one more step, a report was issued, Honorable Speaker, from this legislature, tabled in this House, that described the communities today. It described some interesting things. For example, Honorable Speaker, it showed that in the South Asian community, there were about 120 men to every woman, that people were being allowed in the country but denied the right to family. It showed that there were 37 Chinese Canadian men for every woman in 1921, denying the right of people to be strictly treated in a society, not, Honorable Speaker, as citizens or as family members, but as economic tools of the economy, of the capitalist class at the time, and of the state. That is what they were. That is what that says. That is what those policies did. And even then, even after that time, even after all of these laws have been passed to deny opportunity, these issues were used in election campaigns, in the formative elections of the CCF, in the worst possible of language. We know what was said and how it was said. We know at the time that further ministers and premiers attempted to use the potential of even more laws, even more racism, even more legislative action to deny, Honorable Speaker, even more rights. To suggest, Honorable Speaker, that every single problem in society, from crime, Honorable Speaker, to often, and this involved some parts of organized labor as well, low wages, Honorable Speaker, the lack of success in certain commercial professions of British Columbians, were all put at the feet of Chinese Canadians, Japanese Canadians, South Asians, First Nations, and others. This was an effort on the part of government, of politicians. And it was a successful effort. And of course, Honorable Speaker, we know the subsequent tragedy of what happened, and this House has dealt with this, and my colleague from North Vancouver moved a motion of apology with respect to Japanese Canadians a number of years ago. We know its consequences in World War II for the Japanese Canadian community in particular, which would lose, Honorable Speaker, its land and its remaining and a lot of its dignity and be interred in our very province. These actions do not happen in the abstract. They are the result, Honorable Speaker, of decades of policies diminishing groups in society. That is what they're the result of. And what happens when you do that is that everything ultimately becomes allowed. And it's why it's important that we're doing what we do today. I think that I want to say a few things because this action today, I think the minister would agree with this action of eliminating these private acts, whose discriminatory provisions, I think she's acknowledged, would be overridden in the current context by human rights legislation, the Canadian Charter of Rights, and others, and other actions, Honourable Speaker, is nonetheless important. Why is apology important? Why is reconciliation important in this context and in another context? I think firstly, Honourable Speaker, it's because an apology is due. And here we have citizens of British Columbia in important and significant and broad ways, and in some cases in remarkably petty ways, denied access to basic right. Real losses were felt, Honourable Speaker. A climate of hostility was promoted at an official level. Families were destroyed. But words are not words, are only words, Honourable Speaker. Apology would only be words if action isn't taken, and that's why we are supportive of this legislation. I think secondly, it's important to recognize, Honourable Speaker, that this history belongs to us. It's ours. We own it as British Columbians. We are what we are today, good and bad because of it, Honourable Speaker. Our history of official racism influences our present as much as past laws influence the present in other jurisdictions, from Alabama to Cape Town, Honourable Speaker. However, despite much of the progress we made, the issues involved continue and will continue to affect us. They live with us. And recognizing this is not just important for Chinese Canadians, not just important for people who sit in the legislature, but important for all of society, Honourable Speaker. We deprive ourselves the opportunity of being a better province if we don't understand who we are and where we've come from. And third, I think, Honourable Speaker, it's the case that these are great value as tools of education. And we hope they will continue to be that in future. That is why we took this process seriously. That is why, on the opposition side and on the government side, we engage with young people. That is why we need to ensure that these issues and this reality is taught in our public schools, taught in all of our schools, in fact, Honourable Speaker, to ensure, Honourable Speaker, that these are not just moments of legislative talk, but they are real in society. We need to understand our history in a real sense, Honourable Speaker. We can and we must do better. And of course, finally, there's this, Honourable Speaker. Finally, there's this. We are living in a time, Honourable Speaker, of increasing labor mobility around the world, of increasing circumstances where individuals and groups are treated within their jurisdictions as second-class citizens. This happens in British Columbia as well. You know this, Honourable Speaker, as a former leader of the Canadian Farm Workers. You understand this, that there are many circumstances in the world today where mobility of labor hasn't been paralleled by mobility of rights. And so frequently in the world we live in today, where the value of labor at every turn has been under attack everywhere in the world, workers are at risk. Their rights are at risk. Their rights are at risk by action, which is ensuring second-class status for certain kinds of workers, and reaction, anger about that in communities from around the world. The leading candidate, Honourable Speaker, to be the next president of France, the person leading in the polls, the leader of the National Front, Honorable Speaker, argues for just those sorts of policies. There'll be an election in the Netherlands this week, a place that we generally associate with liberal views, Honorable Speaker. The leader in the polls until very recently was the leader of the extreme right, Honorable Speaker. And then we have the display that we know and we see in its excess in the United States. And the dispute and the need for resistance in that battle, which is being felt both in courtrooms and on the streets in the United States right well. These are the issues of their time, and we have to understand their impact. British Columbia would have been a more prosperous, successful, dynamic province if these laws had not been in place. We would have grown more. We would be wealthier and happier and a better society if these laws hadn't been in place. And the idea that it can't happen again, the idea that it can't happen here, is contrary to what we know, what history tells us, that it comes in waves. And that is why what we're doing here today is significant. It's of importance. It's not a passing thing. It's an important thing. Why it's important, even if these 19 laws don't have force, for us to take the step, Honorable Speaker, of repealing the provisions within those laws today. Why it's important to recognize, Honorable Speaker, that 204 provisions, according to the minister's statement, of laws in British Columbia had discriminatory content, but were no longer in force, and to recognize that that happened, Honorable Speaker. Important to understand today that if legislators in this place had had their way, it would have been a whole bunch worse, Honorable Speaker. That regularly there were calls in this place for the expulsion of Canadians born in Canada from this place to China or to Japan or to India. Why it's important to recognize what happened at the Kamagata Maru, what happened in 1923 with the exclusion laws, to what happened in 1941 and 42 to Japanese Canadians. These are important things for us to do in the present, to teach, to learn from, not to obsess about the past, but to understand who we are and where we come from as a society. So, Honorable Speaker, it's with great happiness, I think, that this process, which we were involved in a small sense, and the minister has done great work on as well, Honorable Speaker, that this process, Honorable Speaker, end in a vote of this legislature that says something different, that speaks hopefully to who we are at this time, and reminds us of how easy it is to slip away from that, to not be our best province, to not achieve our highest and loftiest goals, to not be what we can be, Honorable Speaker. As I said, Honorable Speaker, at the beginning of this speech, Canadian history was in consensus. Canadian establishment was in consensus about the issue of whether Chinese Canadians, Japanese Canadians, South Asians, and others should be second class. And the entire Canadian establishment, almost without exception, until the arrival of the CCF, Honorable Speaker, almost without exception in this country, supported that view. Their only debate was how to discriminate, not whether to discriminate. And so that is why, Honorable Speaker, that is why we need, Honorable Speaker, to understand our past, not to point fingers at one another, because it's our collective responsibility, surely, but to seek and hope for a better future. Thank you very much. I'm proud to support this legislation.